just a note, if you join us in the recording, you can't actually see my face because we're going to concentrate on the slides and the pages instead. So basically the rundown for readings each week is what we'll be following as much as we can. You will be able to see as well a description each week of the topic in context. So right now, I would say, for example, that we're going to be beginning to talk about Latin America in a world context as a geopolitical entity, very important to processes and histories of colonialism and also modernity, with a long history of struggles. So usually the landing page to just sort of orient yourself for each week has this little blurb and a photo, topic and context. And if you scroll through, you'll see the specific readings through each week. So we have some backgrounders by Almeida and Johnson and Raul Zeveji, who's a foremost Uruguayan social theorist. We have a bit of an update because things change all the time. So it's a little bit hard to keep us up to date, but we try to add things as we go. In relation to the material there, if you've had a read or able to have a read, you can always guide your reading with some background questions or points. So I think that that's really just, for your own usage. Let's say, I do usually share a few of the points as well, because some of the questions drill down a little bit more specifically on specific readings. But yeah, we'll just see how much we can do, because we're moving into a different part of the world with parallel but also distinct histories. And so it's important for us to have context as much as we can. So for today, we'll be talking generally, asking those first questions. And the tutorial will focus on obviously presentations that remain for this week, but also just speaking generally about how we understand from this first set of questions the contours of Latin American struggles past and present. And there's actually a video that was put there on the tutorial page to help us to begin to ask these questions. And you can consult the tutorial page for that. So I'm going to share now the PowerPoint slide, which will be kind of a structure of the lecture. Let's see. Before I start, since this is being recorded, I might just give a bit of context as to how it is that I came to think about, study, even work with social movements in Latin America. There's a new term, not so new actually, it has a whole history amongst the Kuna people, that's called Abya Yala, which refers principally to those populations not described by the term Latin America itself, that is, be they indigenous or Afro-descendant. It's a term that's come out of social movements in this geopolitical identity known as Latin America. And so it's important to foreground that. But where in the world, what in the world, how do I connect to Latin America or Abya Yala as well? Sometimes because I did my PhD in Latin American studies, people assume, being a Spanish speaker, that I am actually Latin American, but I'm not. So that's an important first thing to say. The only kind of familial connections that I have really, well, first of all, via marriage, because I married a Mexican. That's just a personal detail. But I've been coming and going between Australia and Mexico principally, but also other parts of the hemisphere for, a good 20, 30 years. I do have some familial connections in Brazil, but I've never had the chance to do anything except speak to them electronically. Part of my family sort of has been a product of empire, but not necessarily in this part of the world and colonialism. My background is actually Irish, Bengali, Anglo-Indian. So is that of consequence? I do think partly yes, even though it's kind of paradoxical in the many paradoxes that we find in colonial processes and identities and knowledges that arise out of that. But I'm second generation migrant. My mom's dad was born in India, but of mixed heritage. So coming to Latin American studies that way, it was an interesting kind of experiment for me as a young person. I was always really interested in questions of colonialism and decolonization as well. So, for example, in year 12, I was the one that chose to look at decolonization struggles, even though everyone was looking at maybe the USA or European history, Russian history, and things like that. I got a little bit of that. I'm not a historian by trade, but it's really hard to know where to separate out one's own heritage and identity and history from one's interests at times. I think that there is a relationship there. But also as a young person, I began to connect to Latin America through working Friends of the Earth. So I don't know if you know of Friends of the Earth. It's an NGO that works in environmental justice, and they're based in Melbourne. So when I was a student in Melbourne, I did a lot of work outside of university studies, working with Friends of the Earth on different campaigns. And that, as I was studying Spanish as well, connected me to terrains of, environmental struggle, in particular in Latin America. And so one of the readings for today refers to the Cochabamba water war in Bolivia, which was really key to the formation of collective action at the turn of the century. And as a student, I worked also with solidarity networks with Latin America, doing translation work, but I also got to find out firsthand from activists what it was like to be in the movements around the water law in Cochabamba in Bolivia. That was 2000. Very much an expression of anti-neoliberal sentiment, and in the face of structural adjustment policies being enforced in parts of Latin America. And here in Bolivia, well, they sought with a consortium, the government sought to make water supply completely privatized. So even if it was droplets from the sky, everyday people would have to pay for that. And so this struck a massive nerve and united people across different parts of society, not just indigenous groups, although Bolivia has 63% of its population that identifies as indigenous. Yeah. So I guess that's kind of where my growing interest as a young person in solidarity networks, in social movements in Latin America began. I don't know if that's something that helps to sort of seed this moment in terms of, where we start off. More latterly, the work that I've done is with, NGOs and collectives in Mexico, especially those involved in LGBTQI rights and justice. Some of the work, well, since we've got two people here, I am recording this apparently. You can see in that book there, and I include the student newspaper because it's actually a queer issue as well. And it's really interesting to see what sorts of trends of struggles around the world they engage with in this particular issue of NISPA, including migrant sex workers, right? Such topics and such struggles are also grounds for action in Latin America. We cannot exhaust the horizons of struggle, in just one lecture, which is introductory, but I do want us to begin to ask questions about where in the world, what in the world, in an attempt to understand what it means to talk about social struggles in Latin America. So if you look at the slides, you'll see that I've got an image of a woman in, I believe it's in Cajamarca in Peru, which is a province of Peru, and she is Andean, she's indigenous. I'm just trying to make that bigger, but it disappeared. Okay, that should work, I'm hoping. And there's a little slogan that's been painted up there, like graffiti, and it says, "Ni la tierra ni las mujeres somos territorio de conquista." So whether or not you speak Spanish, you might see some keywords there. Tierra, mujeres, Territorio y conquista. If you do speak Spanish, you'll know. But if you don't, you might make some kind of connection. Tierra, earth. Territorio, territory, but not of the nation state, right? Instead, where one lives, where one works. And especially for indigenous peoples, what it means to have that connection to both earth and territory. Yeah? And then conquista and mujeres, women, and conquest. We're talking about 500 years, really, from the inception of European invasion of the American hemisphere, 1492. And the town Cajamarca bears the semblance of those years, right? Because it's a mining town, it was established in the colonial period, but you can see that it's not just a historical thing that is being pointed to here. Yeah, it's actually the everyday contemporary period as well. And what does it mean to say that neither the earth nor women are territory of conquest? It's the first question we can ask, yeah? If we think about Indigenous women, if we think about women's struggles of all kinds, how that's linked to struggles around environmental justice, how that's also linked to opposing new forms of colonialism, not just historical, but where history is also important, right? And knowing how to situate ourselves in those histories, actually, and herstories, if you like, and within the region is, really important. We can begin to ask questions about even naming devices. So I'm going to hopefully advance through these slides. It seems stuck. Yeah, okay. So what is Latin America? Where is Latin America? Do either of you study within Spanish languages? Okay. I'm going to be drawing on the work of Mauricio Tenorio Trillo and his book Latin America, The Allure and Power of an Idea. There is another book by Walter Mignolo that's called The Idea of Latin America. It's definitely worth reading. But here I'm just going to draw on some points as related by Ricardo Salvatore in his review of this book. So he points out that for Tenorio Trillo, Latin America is not a geocultural specificity that's just out there. It is a historically defined and redefined one over those 5 centuries, yeah, from 1492, obviously, but also after the period of conquest and colonialism and the formation of nation states and republics. The Americas, even the term America, is born of conquest. The term actually comes from the name of one of the so-called explorers, yeah, who was Amerigo Vespucci. So they derived a name for an entire continent based on the name of an explorer, adapted from Amerigo, which is an Italian name, to America. But already you've got this European kind of template. Mm-hmm.
It's like in Italian, isn't it like it ends with an O, it's masculine, it's an A.
Yeah, so it's changed from masculine to feminine. So that's already a very good point to pick up on, the feminization aspect. Yeah, definitely. So the term still exists, obviously. There are multiple terms that sort of rub up against one another. Here in Australia, people often use South America, but even that is inadequate because it assumes that Mexico is part of the Southern Hemisphere, which it isn't, and other nations in the Caribbean are part of South America, which they're not, right? So at best, it's a floating signifier or a heuristic device. And for Tenorio Trillo, the idea of Latin America is a sort of catalog or map of propositions that need to be criticized or better contextualized under the lens of local and historical specificity. So, giving a bit of historicization from Tenorio Trillo. During the 19th century, the term arose as a defensive strategy against expansive empires, specifically Latin America, in contrast to the United States, or North America as understood in that era. especially amongst Latin American intellectuals involved in independence struggles. One example would be Jose Marti, who was a poet and strategist for independence of Cuba, who unfortunately died in that process. But in 1898, which was a very important turn in geopolitics, Cuba and Cubans were fighting for independence from the US. From Spain, I should say, but then they had to actually confront the US as a new colonial power in the region. So 1898 is when the last colonies of Spain, seek their independence, struggle for their independence. Most of the other parts of Latin America have already gained independence. Of course, it's never a done deal away from Spain. But it's Cuba and Puerto Rico and in particular, within the Caribbean are the last colonies to achieve that through wars of independence. But then the US begins to situate itself as being the new imperial power, taking over from Spain. And so it's really in the face of that, the threat of what Marti called the Colossus of the North, interesting turn of phrase, that is the United States, that independence struggles renew themselves, that the expectation of a threat from the North becomes a kind of shadow on the region. And so using a term such as Latin America in contradistinction to North America is important. From one kind of European colonial power to a new rising power, the United States. And, the United States century is often said to be the 20th century, the American century. Of course, for a Latin American or Latin Americanist, it's problematic to subsume everything under the United States with the word American. In Spanish, we use the term Americano to refer to anyone from the Americas, and America refers to the continent, not to the United States. So already you can see that there's really important tensions. In the late 20th century, Latin America became the receptacle also of various utopian expectations, as well as, from a northern perspective, pessimistic assessments around development, democratic governance, social order, and equality. By the 70s and 80s, the term Latin America became associated with 5 central ideas: a defensive reaction to modern expanding empires, such as the US. And that's still the case in many ways. An alternative to the West, even if it's kind of a byproduct of Western designs. Here, we don't just include the United States, but also the historical relationship with Spain and other parts of Europe, because there were other European powers that had influence, in what we call Latin America, the French, the Dutch, obviously the Portuguese as well. So historically, we prefer to say Iberian rather than Spanish or Portuguese, for example, because it's whomever as a European conqueror came from that peninsula. Latin America has also been interrogated as a site for the either emergence or failure of modernization, again, within developmentalist terms and programs, reflecting very much a northern drive, the US perspective. The flip side to that is within some circles of the left that search for this idea of authenticity in Latin America. So it's like there's so many stories told through and about the term and the entity called Latin America, whether they be stories that are revanchist and kind of racialized as well, as being anti-modern or anti-capitalist, or in leftist circles, a place of utopian possibility. The land of many utopias. This also exists within pan-Latin American movements in the 20th century. The idea of a powerful new race that's mixed, which the large proportion of peoples in Latin America are the product, obviously, of mixture because of conquest and colonialism. The mestizo, yeah, or mestiza, mulatto, mulata. These are terms that are racialized, but denote that combination of mixed heritage. In the 20th century, some state building projects, particularly post-revolutionary Mexico, really relied on this idea, not of inferiority, but the superiority of this new race, if you want to use that terminology, because Vasconcelos, who was a Mexican educationist and also political ideologue, he proposed that instead of being a weakening, that the mixing of racial and ethnic groups in Latin America had produced, yes, in a very utopian way, a new race, a bronze race, a cosmic race even, yeah? And that began to really infuse political thought in places like Mexico. And it really accompanied the sort of corporatist designs of post-revolutionary state as well. We can go into that when needs be in reference to Mexico. We also find the idea of the mulatto and mestizo being used in Brazil, yeah, in its various phases of modern state building in the 20th century. So particularly in the 30s onwards, we see a lot of these projects oscillating around this idea of, you know, heterogeneity being a source of unity, yeah, which might seem paradoxical, but it's a different way of thinking. And for sure, when it comes to Brazil, for example, the idea of racial democracy, you know, we're all Brazilians, which kind of masks, yeah, still the oppressions faced by Afro-Brazilians. It idealizes, yeah, and posits that this is a new construction as opposed to the previous colonial thinking. A little bit like multiculturalism in Australia, or liberal multiculturalism in Australia, succeeding the era of assimilationism and white Australia policy doesn't do away with racism, creates new ways of thinking about what it is to be Australian and who belongs. Not less complicated, of course, but you can see that's involved in state building as well. So just to make that quick comparison. If anything, it's an ideal. Yeah. Okay, so what are the problems with some of the narratives or stories that I've just quickly traced out about Latin America? What do you feel you know already in relation to Latin America? Or even how many nations make up Latin America in today's age? And I'd like to hear from you if you'd like to share.
I don't know that much about that.
So already when we say Latin America, we're thinking of Latin-based languages, aren't we? Yeah, Spanish, Portuguese. And even though they are really important languages that have been promulgated in the name of the nation to create a sense of regional continuity after independence, but also nation-state projects and identities, they kind of squeeze down all that diversity that they also rely on. Yeah. If you want, you can do, when you maybe go back through this PowerPoint independently, you can do a quiz to work out where in the world is Latin America. What is Latin America and what's made up? What countries make up Latin America? Yeah, so there's just featured here Spanish-speaking countries, right? Where that's the national language or one of them. Because it is also true that there are several, particularly Andean states, where actually Spanish is just one, yeah, of the several official languages. But I would encourage you to just play around with that quiz in your own time. 20 or so, 20 or 21 if we include Puerto Rico.
I remember, I'm not sure what the unit was. It might have been a unit of German style.
Yeah.
So they were talking about how the term in Mexico that they used to say like that everyone's mixed, basically, was used as a rhetoric to silence indigenous people.
Very true, very much true. So yeah, it's very much the case. So mestizaje, implies mixture, and mestizo, todos somos mestizos, kind of hides behind this idea of national identity as being mixture. What is really going on with state building, which is the exclusion, including through those discourses and practices of identity formation of Indigenous people in a contemporary frame. Concomitantly, at the same time, in state building processes, because it's corporatist in the 20th post-revolutionary 20th century Mexican context, indigenismo becomes a discourse led by the state as well, to absorb certain indigenous peoples into the state's workings at the exclusion of others, especially those more radical, right? So mestizaje as a discourse and a set of practices around identity and nation is also accompanied by indigenism in political and artistic terms in the post-revolutionary state in Mexico. So it's purposeful to bring that up. But there are other notions. Abya Yala, as I said, that's risen out of social struggles in Indigenous America, cross borders, and Afro-America. So there are alternate visions as well, yeah? And they become guides to rethink from below, actually, and rework from below. All right. Just to give you a sort of demographic picture, I guess, I said 20 or 21, depending on whether we include one nation or another. As part of Latin America, Puerto Rico has a status as being a free associated state, but kind of dependent on the United States without autonomous, adequate political representation of its own, right? But it is a site that's really important for us to think about when we talk about the continued logics of empire and colonialism, especially with reference to the US. But to just allocate as if they just exist freely out there, independent nations without reference to Indigenous and Afro-descendant groups, the many languages, the many peoples, would be a great mistake. It would be being complicit with the historical narratives about conquest and national identity as well. So if we look at some of the big language groups, we can see in Mexico, well, Mexico actually about 15% of the population identifies as Indigenous. One would assume that the bulk is identifying in one way or another as being mixed or mestizo. Some people would also say they're European, right? There are also populations of Syrian descendant people and people from the former Balkan, from the Balkans. There are peoples from Lebanon as well, but that's not just exclusive to Mexico. It's also true in Argentina, for example. But we can see some of the major language groups in current day Mexico include Nahuatl, which was the language of the Aztec Empire. It still exists, but in a modern version, and it's spoken by about 1 million speakers. And there is a lot of literature and scholarship written as well within Nahuatl, and poetry, yeah. Purepecha, which is another linguistic group, the Zapotec people. This is just an approximation because there's many more. There's like 68 different language groups in Mexico alone. My partner is Mixtec, so just right alongside the Zapotec, but less on the isthmus and more on the interior of Oaxaca. And in Oaxaca alone, there are 36 different ethnicities. It's very ethnically diverse, yeah. And next to Oaxaca, you have other southern states. Off to the right, down south, you have also Chiapas, which is mainly Mayan territory, right? And really important as a base for the emergence of the Zapatistas that you may have heard of before. Then if we go through what is Central America as well, Garifuna, we also have mixed Indigenous and Afro-descendant groups, right? Which have a very strong sense of territory and belonging to that area, to those areas. You can see in South America, of course, Amazonian peoples, Andean peoples as well, with different languages. maybe it's not hugely visible there, but the Shipipo, within the jungle, yeah, many of whom are also like involved in traditional medicine and rely on the Amazon, yeah. The Aymara and Quechua highland peoples, yeah, of places like Bolivia and Peru, but also parts of Chile. So they don't really obey borders, right? Because they were crossed by borders by the formation of nation states. And so true is true of the Mapuche people who straddle both sides of the mountain range, the Cordillera between Argentina and Chile. Chile is that really long stretch of land that you can see in blue, gray radar area. It's one of the most extensive territories that covers all sorts of topographies. Don't fall asleep. I know it's tempting. I'm tired as well. Um, but it is also the thinnest territory. It's just right on the edge. It's all pretty much coastal, except that it hits up against the mountain range with Argentina. And the Mapuche people still have that sense of ancestral land very strongly because they were not dominated during the conquest. It's only the last 150 years or so that they got incorporated by force into the Chilean nation state. So there's a lot of diversity in terms of histories, which we have to attend to. That graphic in Spanish tells us how many speakers and percentages as well. Some of those shift according to the census that will be taken periodically, and also the political moment. Yeah. So during Evo Morales's period, he was the first indigenous president of Bolivia. Many more people felt proud to identify as indigenous more than ever before. That's why figures like 63 can exist, because historic and ongoing racism sometimes means that people will not, in a census, identify as indigenous, because there might not be any advantage to that, right? Or might be disidentified in some measure. Guarani, Awa, the Lenca people of Honduras. I mean, it's pretty incredible how these groups have survived 500 years, really, and into the contemporary period. But, some national areas, such as Mexico, count on a larger number proportionally than others. That is not to say that there are not indigenous groups throughout the region. It's just that they may be less visible on the national panorama or more marginalized as well. So look at Argentina, look at Uruguay, look at Paraguay. Their figures is a bit more how figures of indigeneity get represented in the Australian census. Yeah, if you think about it that way, although it's slightly more in the Australian case, like 3.5%. But that will differ also in accordance with where you are in Australia, right? And then we have countries like Panama that, 12.3% identify as indigenous. In Colombia, 3.4%. An important territorial group is known as the Wayuu people. Yeah, some have their own form of autonomy and some degree of recognition. Others do not, or have that kind of under threat as well. Now, here it's important to mention that when we use them Afro-descendant, we're talking about people who are descendants of enslaved peoples within the so-called Middle Passage, yeah, where European powers forced into manual labor and displaced millions of people from parts of Africa. As concerns what we call Latin America, the territory described, even if it's not a fixed territory, the largest amount of Africans from West Africa were forcibly removed and ended up in the Caribbean and in Brazil, but also throughout the coastal areas as well of Latin America. So there are Afro-descendant peoples in most nations of Latin America, or people with mixtures, yeah? So Afro-descendants in Latin America are very prominent in Brazil, very prominent in Venezuela and Colombia, the Dominican Republic, in Cuba as well, right? They really stand out in terms of social struggles as well, and sheer numbers, let's say, and also attachment to, in the case of Colombia and Brazil, certain territories. Now, it's no coincidence that as enslaved peoples, historically, they were put to work in extractive economies, mining, plantations around the cultivation of coffee, cotton, sugar, tobacco, and so on and so forth. Slavery was finally abolished. Last nation to abolish slavery was actually Brazil in 1898. And obviously, the US partook of this and other European nations, not just Latin America, but the largest amount of enslaved peoples were forcibly removed to what we call Latin America, right? So that's important to the history. So the current borders between even the US and Mexico, let's just start there. Yeah, they're very new. They only changed in 1848. Prior to this, Mexico had gained its independence from Spain. It was previously called New Spain. Yeah? In 1822. That was the period of independence for Mexico and some other neighboring countries. But Mexico spanned a larger proportion of what we see as the United States these days. That map gives you an idea. Do you know, just anecdotally, which parts of the US were formerly part of Mexico?
Louisiana.
The Louisiana Purchase. Okay, that was actually from the French.
Oh, okay.
But you're right to start with those sorts of timelines because the US started off as 13 colonies, yeah, on the East Coast, right? And we know the stories about the Pilgrims and all that kind of thing. But westward expansion and as an ideology of manifest destiny, right, started much earlier even than the Mexican-American War, which resulted in the concession of all this territory from Mexico to the United States. If you kind of look at the map, it will give you an idea. And also some names of states and cities in the US, which is actually Spanish. Los Angeles, second biggest Mexican city outside of Mexico City. All of California was part of Mexico. Yeah. Colorado, which means colored earth, that was part of Mexico as well. We could go on. Most of the southwest of current United States was part of Mexico. Mexico was a huge territory before this. Well, in the US, they call it the Mexican-American War. In Mexico, they call it the US invasion. Right? It happened over 2 years, this conflict. And many indigenous people were affected by this as well. So in current day debates, yeah, not just under Trump, but also previous administrations, but also heavy-handed tactics, including deportations. It is assumed that if you're a Mexican American, that you're an immigrant. That's not the only story. There's a much larger story here of people who did not just cross borders, but were crossed by borders. Yeah. And Texas is part of that story as well. Yeah. So we didn't cross the border crossed us. Yasnaya Aguilar, who's a Mique linguist from Oaxaca, has a piece which I could share with people that's called The Map and the Territory. She says the very existence of indigenous peoples and the defense of their territories calls into question the legitimacy of state borders, whether between the US and Mexico or within countries of the region itself. So, as alluded to, Latin America is really a coinage. It comes through a French thinker who came up with the term Amérique latine before 1830, before the first independent nations. It didn't even exist. If America was the product of a Renaissance and Enlightenment, Europe's unknown yet newly discovered, the discourse of discovery, the New World, other on whom depended all these templates that they imposed and try to make sense from a European mind. Latin America was a variant of this original notion, between America, and Latin America. It became one that mapped a series of newly emergent nations that sought to establish themselves in the era of independence, roughly from 1810 to 1830 for the majority, but even up to 1898 in the case of Cuba, that had been under the helm of an elite class of Spanish heritage but American-born people. Yeah, so it's very interesting that the first movements for independence are not on the basis of we're not like you completely. It's just we want greater autonomy of our regions because they were European descendants themselves, but they were joined by a lot of other peoples, yeah, who were resentful of European domination, the 4 centuries or so of it, yeah, and who had nothing to lose. So a lot of Indigenous and Afro-descendant groups also rallied behind the calls for independence. And this was made possible by a kind of, if you want to think about political opportunity, a cleavage within power of the Spanish throne back in the continent. Yeah, so Napoleon, he was very instrumental in creating a lot of upset, and he put his brother on the throne, and that caused instability in the Spanish crown. Yeah, and it was kind of a political opportunity structure back in the day for people to start rebelling. Haiti was really important to that as well because the other colonies saw the first uprising against the French, yeah, of an African descendant nation. So a lot of things were changing at this time. But the 20 countries also that make up Latin America and the Latin American imaginary are hence a product of all of these processes. Subjugation and mixing, also containment sometimes of indigenous peoples on reducciones like reserves, but also in states of peonage in the colonial period, the importation of enslaved peoples, the eventual outlawing of slavery, but the persistence of racism as well. The majority of the republics and nation states were formed then between 1810 to 1898. Puerto Rico does not have that independent status, although there has been also an independence movement since 1898 in Puerto Rico. And the modern nation state, the idea of, the mestizo, we're all mixed, is what really established that main grammar of the modern nation state from the 30s and 40s onwards, accompanied by this containment of ideas about indigeneity. So we're really covering a lot of time, aren't we, by giving this context from the, but if we're going to talk about the independence period and the history of the new republics formed therein, we can think about it in terms of economic history and political history, the kinds of models of republicanism and the rise of state-run capitalism in the region through nation states. We can think about how that was consolidated, but also contended over, what new pressures were brought to bear over the 19th, 20th, and now 21st centuries. We could see some cross currents in those periods. Consolidation, but also crisis, pushes for modernization, constant reiterations of the need for development and developmentalism, the challenges of dictatorship, and also what's called democratization between the 30s and the 80s. A lot of parts of the Southern Cone, Argentina, Paraguay, Chile, but not only, were under the sway, Brazil, were under the sway of forms of juntas and dictatorships or even authoritarian regimes in that period before the so-called third wave of democratization, yeah, which actually ran alongside, ironically, and this is where we're never free of paradox, yeah, the imposition of neoliberal policy in the region. So seemingly they go hand in hand because free market means free society. But actually the first place in which neoliberal policy began to be rolled out was in dictatorship Chile, under a regime that was repressive. So you can see there's a very different variety. They don't necessarily go hand in hand. 1973 was really important, September the 11th, in this part of the world because there was a coup d'etat which deposed the elected president, Salvador Allende, was the first elected socialist president in Latin America, and the coup was sponsored by the CIA. Yeah, and in his place was put the junta militar led by Pinochet, Augusto Pinochet, and that was in power from 1973 until 1990, a long time. But some of the neighboring countries were also under the sway of, yeah, authoritarian regimes and juntas as well.
So America was supporting the socialists.
No, America was opposing.
Also,
the coup was to depose Allende and install, someone's favorable to their interests. It's okay. This room is a little bit like weird because of the lights, and maybe it's the time of the day as well. But anyway, the paradox is that neoliberalism is first rolled out as a model during dictatorship in America. It's the first place in the world, actually. This is before Reagan and Margaret Thatcher made it the new way of doing things. There is no alternative, right? As Thatcher said in the 80s. It was first roadshowed in a dictatorship. The Americans sent the Chicago boys, economists, to Chile to re-engineer all of Chilean society on the basis of this model. But within a repressive apparatus. It's very interesting, isn't it? It kind of goes against the other stories of neoliberalism as being all about freeing up the market, being democratizing, etc.
Is that like the Chicago boys coming redesigning Chile's like whole economy?
Yeah.
Also in other Latin American.
Yes, then they use that as the recipe, especially with the defaulting on loans of some of the major middle powers in Latin America, Mexico and Brazil among them.
Yeah.
The IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank started to force these structural adjustment policies to move away from what's known as import substitution development, which was the reigning paradigm between the 30s and the 70s. And a lot of nations in Latin America borrowed loans to finance their internal development, to force them to open up their borders, and basically sell everything off. So this became the grounds for huge waves of revolt, not neoliberalism as an enabling thing, but in resistance to. And in train, that brought in the democratization, not vice versa. So it's really from the ground, and from these changing economic contexts and political contexts of history that we need to really understand the rise of especially modern social movements in the region. They still have connections to historical ones, because very often it's around the same issue: use of land, the defense of territory. It's very interesting to look at. Now, from the outside, as I mentioned, there's often, emblematic images about Latin America, whether as seen in solidarity movements between Australia and Latin America. LASNet is one really prominent one that make use of folkloric imagery, Indigenous people, youth, music, obviously beautiful expressions, right? But they're, again, quite utopian. Che Guevara, which, his image has been so commodified that you sort of wonder, what is there left of the revolutionary in that image? Still meaningful to people. And Guevarism has been very influential in terms of revolutionary change, obviously in Cuba, but also potential throughout the region and the world. But just that one photograph became so symbolic and kind of emptied of meaning to some extent. Then we also have this kind of notion of the noble savage, right? So there's a lot of contradictions, in how people imagine Latin America. But when it comes to social movements from the 80s on, we're not disconnecting from the previous period. We are focusing mainly from the 80s on in the new century, 21st century. Prior to the 80s, struggles were mainly against dictatorship. There was a common enemy. And so a lot of human rights work and feminist work emerged in this vein, especially in countries of the Southern Cone and in Central America. The revolutionary process of the Sandinistas was important there as well, in Nicaragua. Feminist groups, student groups, broad leftist groups working on political rights, solidarity groups, and revolutionary visions were really prominent in the 70s, 60s and 70s. But in the face of these repressive apparatuses of, military dictatorships, the trade unions were pretty much the structure of the traditional left. That changed with neoliberalism and the erosion of labor rights. Yeah, and but it's still interesting to look at this period, right? Because it's the foundations, really, of imagining social action. Between Las Madres de Plaza de Mayo were mothers that turned out every day, even during the dictatorship, because they said we have a moral responsibility to demand the return of our disappeared sons and daughters. They became a model to follow. You can even see that in contemporary Argentina with women's movements and the scarves they wear, right? In Ni Una Menos, not one less. They call on some of the visual memory of Las Madres. Feminist organizing under Pinochet defined some lines of feminist action that were to come post-dictatorship. Then other icons such as Victor Jara, who was a musician who was killed by the regime, by the Pinochet regime. The Nueva Canción movement, you would have tapped into that already in Brazil, Tropicalia. Yeah, you cannot separate social movements out from artistic movements and musical forms of expression either. And murals. Yeah, mural are really important, especially in Central America and those national liberation struggles, especially where Marxism meets liberation theology, which is a rebel branch of Catholicism not approved by the Vatican. So there's already, before the 80s, a lot to work with. But we're really going to be focusing post-80s, yeah, knowing that there's some roots there as well before the 80s. Having been exposed to years of dictatorship, I mean, just look at some of those countries there in the periods. Our focus will be end of 20th and early 21st centuries. Since this time, we see the weight of a perverse confluence of neoliberalism and democratization over much of the region. And we've seen, as such, the emergence of newer civil society actors, not just trade union or workers' movements. It's not like they're not important, but there's many new incarnations, particularly around identity and territory. So Indigenous and Afro-descendant peoples are really important here. Women and LGBTQI organizations. Several multi-sectorial movements brought down actual governments. So that's what I mean by, it's not that neoliberals are waiting for their opportunity or that neoliberal policy freed up spaces. On the contrary, it created massive pressures, yeah? And as a result, people got mobilized, beginning with riots, which look really spontaneous, but consolidating into broader movements. And that led to the downfall of governments because they faced huge crises of legitimacy. Yeah, but from Argentina to Venezuela. This ushered in a period known as the pink tide, the wave of leftist progressivism, which sort of saw its twilight in at least the southern areas of Latin America, so South America, by about 2015. So there's been a pendulum swing back to the right in some of those nations. And we saw also the kidnapping of the Venezuelan president, also a very controversial figure, right? Inheriting and some say diverting the politics of Hugo Chavez, yeah, and the Bolivarian Revolution. More recently, we've also seen the rise of multiple grounds of socio-environmental and eco-territorial terrains of conflict around mining, hydro, and other mega projects. And really, it's about extractivism. What started the whole colonial process was that kind of exploitation and extraction of resources. As an issue, it has just become more and more apparent, yeah, and continues to threaten lives and livelihoods, yeah, of Indigenous peoples particularly. And so there are multiple actors that have been brought into the fray. Of course, with the process of democratization, we do see substantial new horizons that can permit some of that, but they're still contentious. And in terms of the state of democracy, well, one thing is to say you have these civil rights, and another is what political rights, yeah, and what cultural rights. And so there have been a lot of reforms in regard to recognition of different languages and peoples. We'll talk about that in coming weeks. But there's ever-increasing grounds of contention, yeah? So just because you're recognized as a linguistic or ethnic group doesn't mean that you have fundamental land rights, yeah? Control of rivers, topsoil, whether you grant mining concessions, all of that still is heavily pressurized and creating new terrains of struggle across the continent. And also freedom from violence, because there are multiple violent actors that have emerged within this kind of vacuum politically. State, extra state, corporate, tied up also with gendered violence in the region and femicide. So I'll just leave it there because that's enough for now. But we'll pick up on some of this stuff, hopefully at the end after people have done their presentations, just maybe in a very squeezed down way and in the coming weeks. Thank you so much for coming along today. There's more on the slides, but obviously there's a lot of detail. Do you have any questions? Has this been a kind of good intro? Yeah.
So interesting. Especially because it's so like obviously so diverse, but I didn't realize how diverse and like the complexities to it.
It's definitely something that can pull you down into different rabbit holes, that's for sure. But following the lines of geopolitical power, alignments between the right and the US, particularly right now, global fascism, so that's part of the conversation as well, and also the cracks in that, and where people continue to work for grounds of not just resistance, but what they call re-existence, to guarantee the conditions of survival and livelihood. Do you remember the last tutorial we kind of left on that question? How can you talk about hope in the face of war? We have many examples of communities that are still, if not in resistance, creating forms of autonomy and doing otherwise in Abya Yala and Latin America, in spite of all the different repertoires of war, understood as different forms of violence, environmental, gendered violence, state violence, corporate, you know what I mean? And whilst we want to resist utopianism, as we addressed at the beginning, it's still important to look at how people do things on the ground. And so that's what we're doing over the next little while. Thank you. I hope that recorded properly.